Aron Ra, the intellectually dishonest anti-theist extraordinaire, says...
So I happened across a brilliant quote by Abraham Lincoln that I absolutely loved. He said, "It's an established maxim in morals that he who makes an assertion without knowing whether it is true or false is guilty of falsehood, and the accidental truth of the assertion does not justify or excuse him." Which means you can't say something is true until you can show that it is true. You're welcome to say that you believe something, but you can't state it as a fact, because the moment you start claiming facts that are not facts and pretending to know things you don't know, which is what faith is all about, then that's called lying.
Remember this. Claiming to know what you cannot demonstrate to be true, according to Aron Ra, is faith and lying. That's important. Aron Ra also says...
The people who defined the word atheism, like Matthias Knudsen, was the first person to accept the label, to accept the fact that the atheist label fit him. Theism is God belief. Atheism is lacking God belief, so we're without God belief. So,
while that is how the term is used colloquially in modern times, the notion that this is the literal definition of the term is false for at least three reasons. Firstly, the Greek alpha privative prefix denotes negation, and any distinction between without and not is practically inconsequential. The usage of the prefix is such that without is co-equal to not. It's splitting imaginary hairs. This is evidence in the form of a screenshot from a Greek textbook explaining this grammar usage. Secondly, here's a list of 50 other words demonstrating this usage. Being amoral doesn't just refer to an absence of morals, it also denotes not having morals. Being asymmetrical doesn't just mean without symmetry, it denotes being not symmetrical. Being atypical doesn't just suggest a lack of typicality, it denotes being not typical. This can also be said of a host of other terms. Apathetic refers to not having feelings, apolitical to being not political, and asocial to being not social. To this we can add the terms anaerobic, anhydrous, aseptic, asexual, asymptomatic, and so on, as cases where a linguistic distinction doesn't manifest in reality. In every other instance, it seems that lacking or being without a characteristic C does in fact coincide with not C. So while it may be true that atheism is commonly understood as the absence or lack of belief in deities, rather than the presence of belief in their non-existence, I have no valid reason to entertain the claimed distinction. Rather, this stands as evidence that the without usage is an example of semantic word games. Even if that weren't the case, the etymology of the term atheism still cannot possibly be without theism based on the A plus theism, because the term atheism predates theism by nearly a century. The term first appeared in French in the mid-16th century. The earliest known usage, spelled atheisme, with the long S glyph, which looks like a lowercase f without the crossbar, as it is in Old English, is from a 1587 text of a work concerning the trueness of the Christian religion, from French to English by Sir Philip Sidney, author and courtier, and Arthur Golding translator. We can say this with certainty because the 1789 Student's Pockets Dictionary entry for Knudsen reads thusly: Knudsen, Matthias of Holstein, the only person on record who openly professed and taught atheism. It is said that he had about 1,000 disciples in different parts of Germany. What became of him finally is not known. Lived after 1674. We know that the word atheism with an S, despite looking like atheism with a weird L, because the word said begins with the same long S glyph, and is spelled said the exact same way with that long S glyph. Ra, ever the fabricator of false narratives, says...
And Matthias Knudsen realized that he wrote in 1674 that, yes, I am atheist because I don't believe in any God. But I am also a conscientarian because in addition to not believing in a God, I actually have a belief that there is no God. So what we would call anti-theism or strong atheism.
Anti-theism, yeah.
Yeah, he didn't even consider it atheism. He just said, he called it conscientarianism.
There are a couple of problems with this. Firstly, according to Wolfgang Weber's biographisches Kirchenlexikon, Knudsen's claim about a sect of conscientarians, much less the size of the one he suggests, is most likely a fiction propagated by Knudsen himself. More importantly, in his Latin pamphlet, Amicus Amicis Amica, Knudsen does not disambiguate atheist from conscientarianist. As he writes on page 3, since these things are so, friendly reader, no one will blame me if I, together with my companions, of whom I have almost countless number at Paris, Amsterdam, Leiden in England, Hamburg, Copenhagen, Stockholm, and even Rome and neighboring places, regard the whole Bible as nothing but pretty fables with which beasts, that is, the Christians, captivate themselves by their arguments and delight themselves with irrational madness. Moreover, we deny God. We despise magistrates claiming authority from above, and we reject the temples together with all priests. This I say, if we do boldly, we shall be in an evil place, if well, in a good place, so long as this one life endures. It will ever be so. The conscience, namely, is born with us at our birth. It also persists with us in death as we perish. These are the principles nobly born, and whoever rejects them rejects sense itself. The Latin phrase, Deum negamus, we deny God, is unambiguous. If Ra wishes to argue that this is not what Knudsen meant, and that this is not part and parcel to Knudsen's conceptualization of atheism, but a distinct tenet exclusive to his conscientarianism, I'd love to see some evidence of this. After all, I'm showing my work, and recall that by his own standard, if Aron cannot demonstrate that he knows what he claims to true, he's clearly lying. Ra goes on to assert,
Baron de Olbrock also rocked the atheist label, but he did it proudly. He didn't call himself. He also distinguished the people who don't believe in God from the people who believe there is no God. He said.
Aron also alleges.
He said the people who believe there is no God were fools.
Again, if Ra has some actual evidence that de Holbach, whose name he consistently mispronounces as de Holbrock, differentiated between those atheists who simply lack belief in the existence of deities and those who believe in their non-existence, or that he regarded those who believed in their non-existence as fool, as Aron Ra claims, I'd love to see that evidence. I do know that de Holbach is said to have written, if we go back to the beginnings of things, we shall always find that ignorance and fear created the gods, that imagination, rapture, and deception embellish them, that weakness worships them, that custom spares them, and that tyranny favors them in order to profit from the blindness of men. The notion that ignorance and fear of created deities certainly seems diametrically opposed to mere lack of belief in them. I also know that de Holbach wrote in Systems of Nature, atheists are men without a god. They are those who destroy chimeras invented to deceive them and deny the existence of invisible powers because they see nothing in nature which justifies their belief in them. And he wrote, to say that atheism is dangerous is to say that it is dangerous to open men's eyes. It is to pretend that it is beneficial to mislead them. Atheism is only the absence of prejudice, which by destroying the gods restores nature and reason to their empire. Again, the notion of the destruction of deities is in direct opposition to that of mere lack of belief. And I'm still not seeing the claimed distinction between weak atheism and strong atheism to which Aron Ra and others constantly refer. Further, recall that according to his own standard, if Aron cannot provide evidence to demonstrate the truth of what he claims, he is
clearly lying.
Finally, Aron Ra says,
Aron Dahlbrock just said that he is an atheist, and he kept explaining that atheists are people who they're not buying the bullshit. That's all it is. Yeah, that you're telling me the story, and I'm saying, oh, maybe that's true, and maybe it isn't. But I'm not going to believe it. I'm not going to say that I know that it's false when I don't know. But I don't believe it's true either. I don't believe that's an atheist.
Yeah.
Now, within the category of atheist, you can be an anti-theist, as I am, or you can be agnostic, as I used to be for a long time. But then somebody pointed out to me the same thing, that there are not fairies living in your asshole. You know, for the same reasons, do you know that there is no God? And I realized, that's right. But what happened with the agnostic thing, and this confused everybody, was that Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, was irritated by people in his day when they were finding evidence of evolution, which of course completely contradicted the Christian doctrine, biblical literalism. So they were saying that it was proof against God, and therefore they know there is no God. And Huxley thought that was an irrational argument because, technically it is. It does disprove, the biblical literalists, but there are other versions of God that are a little loftier than that and can't be, chopped down quite so easily. So Huxley didn't understand what atheism meant because he's dealing with people who don't know what atheism means, and he didn't know what Gnostic meant either, but he creates this word agnostic, which consequently doesn't make a lot of sense, where he says he doesn't have the belief that God exists, which is atheism technically, and he doesn't have the belief that God does not exist either. And the interesting thing about that is everybody thought that, well, if agnostic means that you don't believe that God does not exist, that means that atheists believe that God does not exist. So he redefined atheism by creating a new word.
Interesting.
But the fact is it didn't mean that ever. I mean, if you go back to Webster's 1828 dictionary, which predates Huxley's invention of the word agnostic, that already, the definition says that atheism already was a lack of belief that there is a God.
Oh boy, where do we begin? Let's start with Huxley. Yes, Huxley knew what the usage of the term atheism was at that time. No, the term that he created, agnosticism, did not change the definition of the term atheism, and in fact, they are two terms discussing two distinct yet related things. Atheism deals with belief. However, not all belief equates to knowledge. Knowledge is typically thought of as justified true belief. Obviously, it is possible to believe things that are untrue and or unjustified. So atheism and theism refer to doxastic disposition. Agnosticism refers to an epistemic disposition, to a certain knowledge. We know that this is Huxley's usage because he tells us as much, writing, "When I reached intellectual maturity and began to ask myself whether I was an atheist, a theist, a pantheist, a materialist, or an idealist, a Christian or a freethinker, I found that the more I learned and reflected, the less ready was the answer, until at last I came to the conclusion that I had neither art nor part with any of these denominations except the last. The one thing in which most of these good people were agreed was the one thing in which I differed from them. They were quite sure that they had attained a certain gnosis, had more or less successfully solved the problem of existence, while I was quite sure I had not, and had a pretty strong conviction that the problem was insoluble. And with Hume and Kant on my side, I could not think myself presumptuous in holding fast by that opinion. So I took thought and invented what I conceived to be appropriate title of agnostic. It came into my head suggestively antithetic to the Gnostic of church history, who professed to know so much about the very things of which I was ignorant. And I took the earliest opportunity of parading it at our society to show that I, too, had a tail like the other foxes." Notice that Huxley makes a point of distancing himself from religious persons and atheists of his time, adopting only the freethinker moniker, refers to gnosis or knowledge, that both the Christians and the atheists claim, specifically mentioning that they, unlike him, profess to know the answer to the question of the existence of deities. He is unambiguously talking about knowledge, not belief. Huxley also writes, the fundamental principle of agnosticism is that one should not claim to know or believe that which cannot be demonstrated. Again, he is unambiguously talking about knowledge and claims of knowledge. And finally, he writes, the agnostic principle may be stated in various ways, but they all amount to this, that it is wrong for a man to say that he is certain of the objective truth of any proposition unless he can produce evidence which logically justifies that certainty. This is what agnosticism asserts, and in my opinion is all that is essential to agnosticism. Once again, Huxley is unambiguously referring to knowledge and assertions of knowledge, not belief. So it seems that when it comes to Huxley's ignorance of terms and alleged effect on the definition of the term atheism, Aron Ra is
clearly lying.
Now, admittedly, I could be mistaken on some of these issues, and if Aron Ra presents some evidence to support his claims, I'll be happy to concede those points. However, when it comes to the statement that atheism was never the belief that there is no God, it was never that. It never meant that. This is absolutely false. Before we forge ahead, let me remind you that, as I've already evidenced, 1, the Greek alpha privative prefix a doesn't denote mere absence. It denotes negation. 2, I demonstrated the truth of this with a chart of terms using this prefix, and in each case the term does indeed denote the negation of the term to which the prefix is affixed. And 3, the etymology of the term atheism cannot logically be the prefix a plus theism, because the term theism didn't exist for another 80 years or so. But it's worse than that for Aron, you see, because whether it was just a pejorative manner or not, according to the Liddell Scott Jones Ancient Greek Master Lexicon, the earlier Greek atheistes unambiguously denoted negation, belief in the non-existence of deities. Modern Greek dictionaries still record that usage. For example, the portal for the Greek language maintained at the Center for the Greek Language provides the denial definition. The English term wasn't taken directly from Greek, but from French, and the historical usage in French is denial of the existence of deities, as shown by the 1740 Trewness Universal Latin-French Dictionary. Even modern atheistic organizations in France, like the Association of Freethinkers of France, still use that same definition. This means that the definition was changed in English. All of the above is evidence of this. And this is where it gets especially bad for Aron. If we look at the definition of the term atheism in the Webster's 1828 dictionary, the very dictionary that he cited, we see the term atheism is defined in the Webster's 1828 as the disbelief of the existence of a God or supreme being. The word disbelief in the Webster's 1828 is a refusal of credit or faith, denial of belief. And the term denial is in turn defined as an affirmation to the contrary, an assertion that a declaration or fact stated is not true. Negation, contradiction. It is often expressed by no or not. Even his own source contradicts him. He is
clearly lying.
I disbelieve Aron. I deny belief in what he is saying. I affirm to the contrary. I assert his declaration that the term atheism never meant belief in the non-existence of deities is not true. But that's not all. Webster's dictionary from 1806 isn't neutral either. It also explicitly defines atheism as disbelief, and an atheist as one who denies deities. Want some more evidence? I'm glad you asked. You see, as best I can tell, this non-belief nonsense is a modern advent. Antony Flew wrote in his famous Presumption of Atheism, whereas nowadays the usual meaning of atheist in English is someone who asserts that there is no such being as God, I want the word to be understood understood here, much less positively. In this interpretation, an atheist becomes not someone who positively asserts the non-existence of God, but someone who simply is not a theist. Let us, for future reference, introduce the labels positive atheism for the former doctrine and negative atheism for the latter. The introduction of this new sense of the word atheism may appear to be a piece of perverse Humpty Dumptyism going arbitrarily against established common usage. This serves as an unambiguous admission that Flew was arguing to change the normative usage from the positive sense to the negative sense, because that wasn't the case at the time. Further, we know that Flew's reason for this change was to burden fix, to redefine the term in such a way as to eschew any need to defend the position. He also writes in Presumption, what the protagonist of the Presumption of Atheism, in my sense, wants to show is that the debate about the existence of God ought to be conducted in a particular way, and that the issue shouldn't be seen in a certain perspective. His thesis about the onus of proof involved that is up to the theist first to introduce and defend the proposed concept of God, and second to provide sufficient reason for believing that this concept of his does in fact have an application. This is important because it's a bastardization of actual skepticism. Yes, it's true that the burden of proof lies with the claimant. And no, there's no such thing as a positive claim or a negative claim. There are just claims. However, this isn't even about claims. Epistemic justification doesn't apply exclusively to assertions. Even if one makes no assertion, one should still be able to justify what one believes to be true. And this is where the skeptator smokescreen comes into play. David Hume writes in Of Miracles, a wise man therefore proportions his belief to the evidence. He weighs the opposite experiments. He considers which side is supported by the greater number of experiments, and when at last he fixes his judgment, the evidence does not exceed what we properly call probability. All probability, then, supposes an opposition of experiments and observations where the one side is found to overbalance the other and to produce a degree of evidence proportioned to the superiority. In all cases, we must balance the opposite experiments where they are opposite and deduct the smaller number from the greater in order to know the exact force of the superior evidence. In other words, real skepticism is necessarily a comparative analysis of the corpus of evidence and arguments in favor of the proposition P to the corpus of evidence and arguments in favor of the negation not P. Unfortunately, armchair philosophers listening to talking heads on the internet who are armchair philosophers themselves and think that each proposition is considered in isolation, bereft of any actual standard at all. They instead insist that the evidence be perpetually presented to convince them to some arbitrary degree based on nothing more than their own opinion. That's why folks like Matt Dillahunty, when presented with the question, what would change your mind, cannot provide a sensible answer. They don't know what the hell they're measuring in the first place. However, this could easily be short-circuited by amending the question to what standard of evidence and argumentation would be sufficient to justify a person's assent to a given proposition P on a provisional basis. The obvious answer to that question is that there is more evidence in favor of that proposition than there is in favor of its negation. And here's the thing. It doesn't matter what P is. These goofs also bastardize Sagan's standard. Yes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. However, these armchair philosophers mischaracterize claims as extraordinary because they're using the term extraordinary in a different sense than Sagan did. What made a claim extraordinary in the sense that Sagan used the term was the same as in Hume's view, an abundance of contradictory evidence. In fact, in Broca's brain, Sagan wrote what he considered scientific aloofness and opposition novelty to be as much of a problem as public gullibility. So,
amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
I'm being hyperbolic, of course. Nonetheless, we can say, 1. Unless Aron Ra can conjure up some evidence that Matthias Knudsen actually differentiated between atheism as a lack of belief in deities, whereas conscientarianism as belief in the non-existence of deities, by his own standard, he's asserting to know what he does not know, and even if it is incidentally true, he is
clearly lying.
2. Unless Aron Ra can conjure up some evidence that Baron Dolbach actually differentiated between atheism as a lack of belief in deities versus belief in the non-existence of deities, by his own standard, he's asserting to know what he does not know, and even if it is incidentally true, he is
clearly lying.
3. Unless Aron Ra can conjure up some evidence that Thomas Huxley's usage of the term agnosticism was to refer to belief rather than knowledge, and that this usage caused the usage of the term atheism to be changed, resulting in subsequent redefinition, by his own standard, he's asserting to know what he does not know, and even if it is incidentally true, he is
clearly lying.
And most importantly, 4. As evidenced by the actual usage of the Greek alpha privative prefix a, as shown in the Greek textbook, the demonstrated equivalency of without and not in dozens of other English terms that utilize this prefix, the fact that the term atheism predates theism by nearly a century, meaning the etymology cannot possibly have been a plus theism, the historical usage of the term in the original Greek, the continued usage of the same definition in modern Greek, the historical usage of the term in French from which it was borrowed, the continued usage in French, the chain of definitions from Webster's 1828 dictionary, the definition from the Webster's 1806 dictionary, and entities flew acknowledgement of the established usage of the term as recently as less than 50 years ago, his advocation for a change of usage of that time, and his reasoning for this change of usage when Aron Ra asserts regarding the usage of the term atheism.
But if you go back to Webster's 1828 dictionary, which predates Huxley's invention of the word agnostic, that already, the definition says that atheism already was a lack of belief that there is a God. So it was never belief that there is no God. It was never that. It never meant that.
There is no question Aron Ra is
clearly lying.
Now, before I bid the viewer adieu, Aron Ra says,
case. It doesn't matter how convinced you are. Belief does not equal knowledge. The difference is that knowledge can always be tested for accuracy where mere beliefs often cannot be. No matter how positively you think you know it, if you can't show it, then you don't know it, and you shouldn't say that you do. Nor would you if you really cared about the truth. Knowledge is demonstrable, measurable.
I would be remiss not to point out another interesting tidbit of trivia. Remember the quote that Aron Ra attributes to Lincoln?
He said it's an established maxim in morals that he who makes an assertion without knowing whether it is true or false is guilty of falsehood, and the accidental truth of the assertion does not justify or excuse him.
Yeah, we don't have evidence that Lincoln ever actually wrote that. What we have is a scan of an 1846 newspaper reporting that Lincoln wrote that letter. We cannot demonstrate that he ever actually wrote it. We don't even have the evidence that the letter to which he's allegedly responding to ever existed either, because we don't have any extant manuscript of the prior issue of the Illinois Gazette. Thus, by Aron's own standard, he cannot show that he knows it, no matter how strongly he believes that he does. And by asserting that he does know that it's a quote from Lincoln, whether he really did it or not, by the standard that Aron Ra has adopted, once again, he is
clearly lying.